So move the first part, and then staying up there for questions.
It's being recorded, so everyone's on the panel.
You guys should also know the platform doesn't go all the way to the wall. The platform doesn't go all the way to the wall.
Mostly joking. Well, I know that you were so. I know. He told me that.
And we're good. So this is
I know, I didn't want to go alone.
Exit deal here.
well, no, I think you, because you're the moderator.
Yeah, I think it was the other way around.
Okay, if people could start finding your seats, or actually finish finding your seats, that would be very helpful.
Can you see the slides from the podium?
You can like this.
Gonna have to do it like this.
Okay.
If this is your good side, you'll have to, we can't accommodate that.
That's such a problem. Yesterday was over here.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a line cord.
Move it just a bit like that. I think you can see.
We can push it all the way to the back, and you can turn it around. Oh, this is on. Sorry. I know. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. This morning, well, let me start with the usual housekeeping. I'm sure that any of you could say this at this point, but the Climate Change Office is starting a new climate change portal or climate change website called Climate Links. And if you would like to be on our soft launch of that, please make sure that the box is checked on the registration form outside. We'll send you a password. It should go online in the next 3 to 6 weeks, and that will become a sort of an official repository for all of the work that the Climate Change Initiative at AID has been generating, not just adaptation, not just the Climate Change Office, but the whole agency, mitigation and adaptation work. Today we are starting, the morning is Climate Service Day or Climate Service Morning. In the afternoon after lunch, we will immediately, sort of during the end of lunch, we'll have a rapporteur's report from Lawrence Bouja over here. And then after that, we're going to do a final session on new directions for USAID. There'll be a panel, and you can ask questions, make recommendations. We can't promise anything, but we will take it all on board as this program winds down and as the agency kind of enters a new phase of adaptation work. This morning, we are very fortunate to have Walter Betkin. Walter is with the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. He gave what until yesterday was, I think, our best monthly adaptation meeting. I'm sorry, Walter, the Macedonians did a hell of a job yesterday. So the bar has been raised, but you've got 10 minutes to reclaim the crown. Walter's going to give our morning very short keynote, and then he'll moderate the session. Walter runs IRI's programs on regional and sectoral work globally, and it splits his time between Uruguay and New York and lots of other places. So, Walter.
Good morning. Thank you, John. I didn't bring any apples or strawberries to compete with the Macedonians. So today we're going to be talking about climate services, and I'm going to be talking about climate services, CAT scans, and Noah's Ark. And we'll see why. First of all, since we're going to be talking about climate services, I think we should agree in what climate services are. And I'm sure that you have seen many definitions. I particularly like this one that is placed on the CSP website, and you can read it. But what I want to emphasize is that the climate services includes 4 aspects: it's production, translation, transfer, and use of climate knowledge. The other thing that I'd like to emphasize is that all of that ends informing, improving actual decisions and planning. So it's not just an interesting process, it has to be a useful process. Now, instead of going or elaborating in a conceptual way on climate services, I prefer to use an example from a different discipline, a medical service. And let's say that the problem that we're facing is a patient has a headache, and his doctor recommends to take a CAT scan. The reason why that patient can take advantage of that medical service is because somewhere in a chain of knowledge, there was some probably nerdy-looking guy that was interested in X-rays. He was not interested in any application of X-rays. He was just interested in X-rays, how they function, how do they reflect, refract. There was probably another person that was interested in trying to analyze that complicated information and maybe develop some method to process information. Again, he was not thinking of any application. He was just interested in how to process this data. Then you get somebody that is interested in application. He said, well, maybe this information can use to detect problems in the brains, in the different health situations. And he started using that information to do exactly that. Then is what John Furlow reminded me to include. Somebody in the private sector sees a good opportunity, a good business opportunity to invest in that, and the CAT scanner is developed. Then you have the guy that operates the CAT scanner, you have your doctor, and you have the patient. And that's a whole composition of a medical service. Now, some interesting characteristics of this service. Think about it. If you take any link of that chain, the whole service falls, including the fundamental and the basic research, which are typically pretty far from the end users. The second interesting thing is that if you go with your CAT scan results and you talk to any of those guys, each one of those guys can give information based on their knowledge and their experience. Very likely, if you talk to these guys up here, they will use a language they will not understand. They will tell you about their knowledge that is not very actionable, but they'll still give information. So in the whole chain, there's only one person that will be able to provide you with information upon which you can act, and that's your doctor. And I wanted to make this mental exercise of changing this medical service into a climate service. So a lot of elements in common. The last comment that I want to make is that even if this whole process works perfectly well, the patient may decide to not take any action. For example, if the conclusion of this analysis is that the reason why the patient is having a headache is because he's eating too much beef, and he's Uruguayan, or he's Argentinian, he's probably not going to change the behavior. Now, think about that from the evaluation standpoint. If you evaluate one process just looking at what the end user does, the process may be perfect. Everything in that chain may be working just fine, but the stakeholder decides not to use that information. That's a very simple caricature, a linear chain of a medical service. In real world, these services look a lot more like that, in which you have networks where you have a bunch of institutions producing knowledge, a bunch of institutions and individuals trying to translate that knowledge into something useful, other institutions trying to transfer that knowledge, and then end users using that knowledge. And what I want to stress here is that if we want to be successful in establishing climate services, we need to understand these networks. And to understand these networks, we need research. And that research has to be as robust and as rigorous as the research that goes into climate models. And I want to emphasize that. Now, this week has been concentrating on resilient development in adaptation to climate change. The first question that a stakeholder asked when we start working in adaptation is, do we need to adapt to what? What is the climate in the future look like? And the best tools that we have now are these climate models. What the climate models do is they take the planet, they divide the planet into small grids, and then in each grid they go several layers up into the atmosphere and several layers down into the ocean. And then following laws of thermodynamics, energy, physics, they simulate the circulation of the atmosphere. What the scientific community has been doing is changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere based on greenhouse gas emission scenarios and see what will happen in the climate in the future. Now, in order to do that, you have to make a lot of assumptions of how the future world will function, how much renewable energy, how much deforestation rates, how many people is going to be living in this world. So very difficult. So what do? They propose a range of scenarios. And then some scenarios are more optimistic, it's going to be more renewable energy. Some are more pessimistic, business as usual. And when they connect those socioeconomic scenarios with the climate models, they change the chemical composition of the models, and you get this type of results, classical IPCC graph, showing the evolution of temperature in gray during the observed period in the past, and then from the 2000s to the future, changes in the global temperature of the whole planet for the 21st century in blue for the optimistic scenarios, in red for the very pessimistic scenarios. And basically what this is saying is that by the end of the century, the global temperature, this is not a temperature for the United States, it's the whole planet, will be somehow between 1 degree above today to 7 or 8 degrees above today, which is equivalent to saying by the end of the century, the price of a barrel of oil will be between $50 and $4,000. So plan with that information. Now, this is temperature for the whole world. If you look at rainfall, then the uncertainties are much larger. And if you look at rainfall at the scale that is most needed, which is regional to local, then the uncertainties are even much, much larger. So, conclusion, the climate change scenarios with the models are uncertain. We really don't know what the rainfall, for example, will do in the future. Still, you still see results like this being published in the literature, where you see a map that by 2080, Mexico will be producing 20% less corn than today. It's ridiculous. Where is the uncertainty there? Now, this is not only bad from the science standpoint, it's dangerous. Because this type of information is a lot easier to understand by a policymaker. Therefore, it's easy to be believed, and it may result even in maladaptation decisions. So clearly, we need a new paradigm to approach adaptation to climate change, to incorporate climate services into adaptation. What is the paradigm that we have been using until now? It's the Noah's Ark paradigm. What happened to Noah? Noah got perfect climate information, built infrastructure, saved biodiversity. Great. The truth is that we don't have perfect information, and we will never have perfect information. So we need a different paradigm. I don't know if you know the ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo biloba is a beautiful tree. Now, in 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped over Hiroshima, of course, everything was dead in a radius of 1 kilometer to the epicenter. Somehow, 6 trees, 6 ginkgo biloba survived. And in fact, they're still alive today. You can imagine the extremely high symbolic value that those trees have for the Japanese. Now, why did those 6 trees survive? One possibility is that this is a very, very old species, has more than 2 million years. And very likely, throughout these 2 million years, the tree had to adapt to a huge range of conditions, including some pretty extreme. And there is a possibility that because it had to adapt with that huge flexibility, the trees were able to be resilient to an unprecedented, very extreme event like the bomb. That's a new paradigm, is adapt with flexibility. Be able to adapt to a wide range of plausible conditions, identify interventions that have the highest chance of success, and start by improving adaptation to current climate. So, final comments. One, I think we all need to remind ourselves that the climate services include those 4 pillars, those 4 activities: production, translation, transfer, and use of climate knowledge, and that they have to inform actual decisions, actual plans. Second, the production of climate knowledge in the climate services require research, even fundamental and basic research. Third, the translation, the transfer, and the use require consideration and understanding of these sometimes complicated information networks. We're trying to help a Minister of Agriculture to improve the elaboration of public policy. Very, very unlikely we will be working directly with him. Where is he getting information? Who are the advisors? Where are the advisors getting information from? There's a complicated network that we need to understand, need to identify weak links, inexistent links. And finally, we need a different new approach on climate adaptation. We need to move from the Noah's Ark to the Ginkgo biloba approach, paradigm. Thank you. So I guess I will. So the remaining of these sessions has 2 parts. The first part, until the coffee break, it will be centered on experiences, generation of climate information, climate services, etc. After the coffee break, the presentation will be focusing more on the assessment, evaluation of climate services. And the first speaker for this session is Steven Zibiak, and Steve comes from the IRAP, International Research Institute for Climate and Society of Columbia University.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My task is to talk mostly about this thing we call the Climate Services Partnership, what it is, and why we created it. I'd like to start, however, with a few comments about the context and the thinking about climate services generally within the CCRD program that's been operating over the past 4 years. And I guess both of these? Yeah. So let me do that first. This context really traces back over many years now, and it draws on the fact that, you know, over this time it's been pretty much a steadily growing recognition that the issue of climate and managing climate-related risks is actually not a peripheral but a central development issue. So this is partly coming about because of our increasing understanding of the impacts of climate across so many sectors of societies. But it's also very much heightened by the sort of mounting evidence of the cost to societies associated with not being that well able to cope with a variable climate, particularly in the context of extreme events which too often translate into disasters, which are very much a development challenge. So in many ways, this growing recognition is an important driver now for climate services. Not climate services in the context of let's produce some forecasts, but in the context of what Walter just said, a whole process that supports climate-informed decision-making and smart policy and planning. Over these years, we've seen a variety of initiatives in climate services from the international UN level, and the global framework for climate services, many national programs, institutional programs, and the like. But it's fair to say that this is still a learning process, and all of those involved know that there are many challenges to getting climate services that actually serve the decision and policymakers. Not only technical issues, matters of how do we get different communities to collaborate who have to in order to make climate services work, institutional arrangements and the like, many, many challenges. And so it is still a learning process, and no one has figured it out completely at this point. So in that context, early in CCRD, we kind of had a look at the current situation and tried to think about what should this program do. And out of that, we came to a couple of things. We wanted to actually go ahead and work toward development of regional and local capacities in a few specific places, bringing together a framework for what is needed to put a climate service together that works, based on limited but good practice examples that we could bring to it. And then secondly, the other issue, because there is so much learning going on, but the efforts are still not that well connected, to figure out how to capture the larger knowledge and build collaborations broadly to help push this whole field forward. So that was the motivation for creating this thing we call the Climate Services Partnership, which is an informal and open process that is basically dedicated toward improving the knowledge and the practice of climate services. We have a rather diverse membership, which includes various researchers, but also information providers, certain classes of users, and those that are funding climate services. They come together, and we've come to feel that creating this platform is beneficial in the context of increasing our ability to more effectively and efficiently exchange knowledge and to build collaborations that add value to the work that all the various parties are already doing. So this was created in 2011 at the first International Conference on Climate Services. One of the things that everyone felt right from the outset was, okay, let's figure out how we can actually learn more of what is going on, what is being learned, what works, what doesn't work, so that we can all benefit from this individual experience. So we set up a variety of activities at different levels of depth to look at what's going on. There is a kind of survey of climate services globally that we've begun and add to gradually over time. A set of case studies that were developed around the world, about 40 or so, that try to dig a little bit deeper, but they are self-reported by our various partners. And then we also had commitments early on to do a couple of activities that went deeper into the evaluation or assessment domain, where we would try to learn more than what just happened, but what are the opportunities to improve on what was learned, and what is the benefit to the extent that that can be assessed. So you're going to hear more about several of these things later on, so I don't need to focus any more on them now, and I'll just move on. Another very important function in the partnership is its convening function, and certainly the most important venue for that are the continuing ICCSs, the International Conferences on Climate Services, which we've held yearly over the past 4 years. This has now assembled several hundred active folks that are invested in climate services, share an interest in improving the knowledge and practice of climate services. The ICCS has been very good at building connections in the community, good forums for exchanging, what are we learning, and especially for sort of deliberating together on what needs to be done, what are gap areas in order to improve the practice of climate services. And from them, we created a number of working group activities, which I'll say a bit more, and we're also going to hear more about those later today in several cases. We've also convened workshops that are more topical, for example, in the evaluation arena, and co-convened with CCAFs and USAID and WMO, a workshop, for example, in Africa, looking at climate services for farmers, basically, smallholder farmers in Africa and South Asia. So there are just a couple examples of that. Now, these working groups are several folks assembling together who have some knowledge and expertise and interest to pursue these various topics that have emerged as important areas for more and new work. We have a working group that has worked on the issue of the economic valuation of climate services. How do we move toward a more meaningful way of assessing what the benefit is for a certain amount of investment? Glenn will be talking about this later on today, so you'll hear a lot more about that. We've also had a group that's been thinking about the process of evaluation in the context of climate services. How do we develop methodologies that are practical and informative that could be helpful to those who are either investing or considering investing in climate services? What do they get out of it? Which is also a critical need. Things like the ethics issues of climate services have emerged from our rich discussions at these meetings. And that may surprise some folks, but actually there are a number of ethical issues involved in the delivery, even the design of climate services that folks are increasingly recognizing. Do we need community standards and guidelines for the conduct of climate services? I think the answer from quite a bit that we've been doing so far and surveying the community is yes, but a lot needs to be done to figure out what are the appropriate standards and guidelines. Another topic that's come up is the intersection with research. Walter mentioned the importance of research. A particular lens on this is in the practical rollout, in the implementation of climate services, what issues are being faced that actually raise new research questions? How can that practice inform research rather than just thinking about research as a push that somehow is taken up? Can we get some feedback that will sort of expedite progress? And we've had a group that was focused more on developing country contexts. This arose from the first ICCS when we had the Adaptation Partnership Workshop that was looking more at the developing country context. And so we've discussed a number of specific issues for climate services in those settings under that group. Another class of things is more in the area of the mechanisms of exchanging knowledge. We've introduced a communication, a newsletter, which has been operating over the past couple of years quarterly. This is a way of just providing up-to-date information, announcements, thought pieces, ways of just keeping people informed of what's going on or what they might want to be involved with. And this has been a pretty good community building mechanism. So we've heard from the group. We've had some webinars and online forums where we have partner updates or special topics being discussed. And of course, everything that the CSP has been doing, as well as a lot of partner information, is being broadcast on the web-based knowledge platform, which is climate-services.org, sorry. Finally, just a couple of words. I think we've recently been kind of consulting with our membership about what they feel like they've been getting out of this so far. I think one of the most important messages we've heard is the opportunities for networking and linkages that have been facilitated by this that were just not necessarily happening before. In some cases, whole programs have been able to come together and talk about common interests and collaborations that weren't doing so before. The way in which we could deliberate by bringing all of these experienced folks that are invested in climate services together to figure out what do we need to be doing that we're not doing already, and then to take some actions to move forward on them. And I think we've been working little by little in trying to identify in what we're learning about different programs and activities and what are the beginnings of good practice in various aspects of climate services. So therefore, looking ahead, I think, yes, we already have a number of outputs and resources that will continue to be available and I think continue to have value. But I think we need to now look at how we can continue some of the functions that we've had under this partnership under different sponsorship models. And there are a number of ideas, but one of the things that is quite important, many of us feel, is to align some of what we're doing where appropriate with major programs that many investments are being directed toward. For example, the Global Framework for Climate Services, which I don't have time to describe in detail here, but it's a UN-led process internationally, of course. So we need to align around these programs as well in order to continue to have value. Anyway, it's been a good experience for those involved, and we think it really has made a difference in the work of many people in thinking through climate services and trying to get them on the ground. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Steve. The next speaker is Glenroy Brown from the Met Service of Jamaica.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to start off by taking the opportunity to thank USAID, the hardworking team from CCRD project, for this opportunity to come here and showcase the climate smart tools that we have created for the agricultural sector in Jamaica. Just give you a little background knowledge on Jamaica. Jamaica is the 5th largest Caribbean island. It is located just south of Cuba, to the east of Haiti, and to the west of the Cayman Island. It's the most beautiful Caribbean island nation, and that is just not my opinion only. It's the opinion of all the visitors who have visited Jamaica. We have a population of about 2.6 million, and it's about 11,000 square kilometers. Jamaica is also the home of the Olympic champion and the world record holder, Usain Bolt, right? So, developing climate services in Jamaica for the agricultural sector was never an easy task. We had to identify a lot of champions, and yes, we had champions, not just Usain Bolts, but champions among the farming community, champions amongst our stakeholders. Because we wanted to develop a tool that was built from the bottom-up approach, and basically we want the involvement of the farmers as well as the involvement of the stakeholders. So we had several farmers forums, sessions, to look at the needs. So we basically met with the groups, stakeholders, farmers, to look to identify what type of services we could provide for them. During those sessions, we identified that the key areas that they wanted information, climate service information, basically was from early warning, like drought, early warning for drought, and also a real-time weather forecast for their particular community and their farming area. We are so accustomed to the forecast from the Met Office, and they are very general, partly cloudy with isolated showers, and those were not the best forecasts for the farming community. So we developed a few tools, which I will discuss shortly, how we actually enhance the climate services for the agriculture sector. But why climate services and early warning tools for the agriculture sector? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change considers small islands like Jamaica to be some of the most vulnerable to climate change. This is because climate change will have disproportionately higher impact on our societies, economies, and ecosystem in ways that will increase our vulnerability. Agriculture in Jamaica is particularly vulnerable to the variation of climate variability and change, given its open field nature, high number of small holdings, and high dependence on rainfall. In recognition of this, a working group on climate services for the agriculture sector was developed in May 2013. The group was co-chaired by the Meteorological Service and RADA, which is an arm of the Agriculture Ministry, and it comprised of other members from the Caribbean Agricultural Research Development Institute, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture, USAID-funded ACDI Vocal, as well as the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. What were the goals of the group? It has 3 clearly defined goals. Identify priority areas needed for climate services in the agriculture sector, to develop tools and services to address the needs identified, and to provide interactive training for key stakeholders in the sector, including feedback mechanism to assess the performance. Also, the activities that were carried out harmonize with and build on similar and regional endeavors, like the Caribbean Agro-Meteorological Initiative, a project that was implemented in 10 Caribbean countries between the period 2007 to 2012. Also, priorities identified in the IRI-funded 3rd International Conference on Climate Services held in Montego Bay, Jamaica in December 2013. So, with that, rather than reinventing the wheel, what we did was to have advanced the progress in the journey towards enhancing food security and nutrition security for Jamaica. Sorry about that. So what are the specific success of the project to date? We build the awareness of the available weather products, which include Farmers Bulletin disseminated to extension officers, and these bulletins were transmitted on a monthly basis. We build a web portal that allows persons to get 5-day weather forecasts for specific communities. We develop a database where we have with the farmers for sending them text messages indicating when severe weather conditions are likely, such as drought and flash flood. Training of extension officers, as well as post-training review. Secondly, we conducted assessment on the usefulness of the monthly Farmers Bulletin. This was done through focus group discussion held with farmers and extension officers, stakeholders consultation. We have several farmers forums that were conducted with ACDI Vocal, RADA, the Jamaica Met Service. These farmers forums are continuing. We have several of those farmers forums last year, and those farmers forums basically is to expose the farming community basically about the tools that are available, show them how we have developed their ideas into these climate smart product tools. Thirdly, further development of the drought and precipitation monitoring and forecast tool was done. We now have a probability forecast for rainfall 3 months in advance, a probability forecast for temperature, where you can get 3 months in advance as well. We're now doing drought forecasts for selective stations across the island, basically 3 and 6 months in advance. So we have developed these early warning tools. Let's look at, this is a synopsis of basically what the probability forecast tools look like. We had the biggest challenge we have here was communicating the probability forecast because of the uncertainty that lies in the forecast. But we're able to come up with creative ways to bring that across to the farming communities. And we engage them in different types of game and activity in order to explain how probability forecasts will work. But we still have a challenge, even within our own organization, explaining how probability forecasts will work. This is our drought forecast tool using the Standard Precipitation Index. Basically, this was a first for Jamaica. This tool was developed with the International Research Institute team. Basically, what we did was to use the monitoring conditions of the SPIs and incorporate that into a computer model, which will give us a prediction for drought forecasts. This is actually placed on our website, and it's done in a GIS map. It's very easy. This was based on the request of the farmers, where we can use the different colors to indicate the areas easily to them that are likely to experience drought in the next 3 months or 6 months. And this tool itself was the first in Jamaica, and the tool is now been, we have collaborated with the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, and that tool is now being used right across the Caribbean for drought forecasts for different countries. Our real-time weather forecast basically is a community-based forecast tool. And what a community-based forecast tool does is basically what we do is to downscale the global forecasting model from a 50-kilometer resolution model to a 10-kilometer resolution model and overlay that on a GIS map. So it gives the user indication as to what is likely forecast for their specific community over the next 5 days. It is widely used in Jamaica, and it is favored by the farmers because it can also be used on a simple mobile phone, not just a computer. And lastly, I will end with my takeaway message here. And I know what you're thinking, but I'm not trying to say that we want to develop champions of climate services and turn them into skillful beer drinkers, but rather the Jamaica Met Service will continue to be a champion for climate services and to inspire, educate, and empower our partners with the right skills needed to take the work started by the CCRD project forward. And with that in mind, I thank you for the time.
So I forgot to mention that before the end of this session, before the coffee break, we will have hopefully 40 minutes for your comments and discussions. The next speaker is Lisa Goddard. She's the director of the IRA, of the International Research Institute for Climate and Society.
Thank you, Walter. And thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss our project here. This project we often refer to as IRAP, which is the International Research Applications Program. This is a particular project, actually the singular project under that program, integrating climate information decision processes for regional climate resilience. So this was not originally scoped under CCRD, but the objectives of IRAP and of the project are certainly very much in line with CCRD, and that is broadly to increase resilience through supporting decision-making and risk management through the improved design, production, provision of use-inspired climate information. This schematic gives a sort of broad overview of our approach. Our approach focuses very much on partnership and on iterative, problem-specific solution building. So in this left circle under process, here's where we bring the teams together and work on the iterative approach. I cannot overstate the importance of having very strong multidisciplinary teams, bringing together the expertise, people that are strong in their disciplines to work together on these problems. So, you know, although all of these institutions, the University of Arizona, the International Research Institute for Climate Society, IRI, and our regional partners all have their own spheres of work where we come together, bring our expertise together on those specific problems. And our regional partners are collaborating both in the research, but it's also bringing in the practitioners and the decision makers, in some cases even the policy makers. And again, where we come together to work together on these problems is really critical. The process, as I mentioned, is iterative, so going through a needs assessment, thinking about how that motivates product development, the evaluation of that in an iterative process. This is something that I know is embraced by many of the CCRD projects. And then within that process, there might be quite a bit of information that's maybe not used as effectively as it could be. Maybe it's not tailored for the specific problem. So there certainly is opportunities for research even within this process. But there's also often research that can be brought to bear on the problems to really think about new innovative ways to address these problems more specifically. And again, although all of these circles, evaluation, decision support, climate vulnerability, are all research areas in their own right, where they come together and we're using those disciplines to think together about these problem-specific areas is where we think the advantage is. So our belief is that bringing together the right partners and involving the right process, having the right research focus is then going to lead to beneficial outcomes, which then impacts on enhanced climate resilience and adaptive capacity. The approach that we're undertaking within IRAP is based on 5 pillars. And I should say that these 5 pillars are really a distillation of decades of experience at both University of Arizona and IRI. In fact, Jim and I did a calculation at some point. I think there's something over close to maybe 1,000 human years that are being brought to bear in experience for this project. An important thing that goes through the pillars, which I'll step through in just a moment, is the importance of considering climate information across time scales. So we're not just talking about climate change. We will get to the end of the century eventually, but we're going to get there 1 year at a time. The communities that we work with are going to experience climate and climate shocks 1 year at a time. And we know that most of those communities are not adapted to the current climate, whether those communities are urban or rural, they're not adapted to today's climate, and that's something that we can do something about now. And the time scales, what information is most important, what do we want to bring into the particular decision support context, really depends on the decision context. And so what matters the most is what matters to those decisions, and there are quite a few in fact, in most cases, decision makers, planners, managers that really have to consider the risks and opportunities at multiple time scales. So in these 5 pillars, and these are all linked, as you'll see, in the first one is identifying vulnerability, so vulnerability assessment, and that has to do with examining the exposure, the sensitivity of communities to climate impacts, their capacity to adapt or to recover from climate shocks, but it also involves mapping the networks that are involved, the sort of networks that Walter showed. What's a flow of information? It might involve decision calendars. So in these pillars that I'm showing, you'll just see some specific examples. It could involve decision calendars, even in vulnerability assessment, because you need to know who's making what decisions and when do they need to make those. That helps determine what information needs to be brought in, the timeliness of it, and that quality may be influenced by these considerations. But that absolutely then feeds into the second pillar, which is more related to climate information, understanding, quantifying, and reducing some of these uncertainties that Walter was discussing. Observations are a critical starting point here. And in many developing countries, those observational data sets are not readily available. Certainly data poverty is a real concern in many parts of the world. So even working with communities to bring together local rain gauge data, say with satellite estimates, can be an important starting point. And it's not just the availability of the data, it's also the access of that information and how can it be used in the decision support context. So having those observations then allows communities to make better seasonal forecasts, to understand to what extent they're better or appropriate, and even to assess if the processes or what's been experienced from these tools that we use for climate change projections, are they reasonable? So climate information, it needs to be of high quality, it needs to be reliable, relevant to the problem, and available in a timely manner. The third pillar is related to technical interventions, and some of these technical interventions may be things that effectively climate-proof your communities that could be brought in. It might be vaccinations or drought-resistant seeds or building improved infrastructure, but it can also be information technology. And I would say capacity building and training fits under this pillar, as does even this type of a technology, being able to disseminate information, decision support through things like smartphone interfaces. The fourth pillar is related to institutions and policies. In this particular example, the intervention of climate-based index insurance can be extremely valuable. I would also put under this pillar early warning and early response systems, since that often requires policy in order to make those effective, forecast-based finance and credit. But in addition, making sure that the institutions that are targeted to take up these interventions actually have the mandate, the people doing the work, it's in their job description to be able to do this. That's an important consideration, and that really requires then working with those institutions to make sure that they have the right policies and institutional structures to be able to take these things up. And then last but by no means least is evaluation. So this is something that needs to be at the outset of the project. It needs to be integrated throughout the project. So the importance of having evaluation at the beginning to set a baseline so that later on, once the project, at least the funded part of the project, is wrapped up, but even beyond that, that you can quantitatively assess the outcomes of that project. And in the process of the project, it gives you a way to monitor the progress so you can make these sort of midterm corrections that we all know are very important to having successful outcomes. So in our IRAP project, the sectors that we're dealing with in different parts of the world: water, disasters and extreme events, agriculture and food security, development issues, and coasts. In the first year of IRAP, this is a 5-year project. We're about a year and a half in right now. The first year we were targeting the Caribbean region, working with our partners in the Caribbean. And we held a workshop that was held in conjunction with the Climate Outlook Forum that Glenroy referred to just a moment ago. And so that gave us an opportunity to work together with the Met services, with the communities they work with, the practitioners, the scientists, the decision makers that these Met services are working with on a regular basis, to start to think about how can we move the science forward even more effectively together. And so there's a list of activities that we engaged this audience with that allowed us to make some progress on our 5 pillars, start to gather some data and acquaint that audience with our approach. Near the end of the meeting, we did discuss some focused projects that would allow us to really drill into specific decision making with that full spectrum of partners. And so I should add that IRAP is working in 2 directions, and this is an example of that. So in the case of the Caribbean, working at a regional scale through through the right entry points there, which in the case of the Caribbean is the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology. They're a very coordinating influence within the Caribbean. And so they actually hold every single month these virtual climate outlook forums. Twice a year they get together in person, and that's what was represented in this case. The map on the upper right is an example from that first experience of putting out a drought outlook that Glenroy has just described being expanded throughout the Caribbean, and that provided then the seed of discussion for these different activities. But then focusing in on a specific problem to work at the local scale with local decision makers and really test out the full 5 pillars of IRAP approach. The problem that has come to the fore in terms of timeliness and engaged partners, and something that climate information could help inform, is coffee leaf rust in Jamaica. And this is something that can absolutely be transferred to other parts of the tropics. And I think that the process and the idea of partner building can also be transferred to other problems within Jamaica and within the Caribbean. So it does involve a number of partners, IRI and University of Arizona as leaders of the IRAP project, but it also involves the Jamaica Met Service, Jamaica Coffee Industry Board, University of West Indies, the Inter-America Institute for the Cooperation on Agriculture, the bank, and also the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology at the regional scale to keep these things together and to help do the transfer. So that gives an overview of what we've done to date. We're now engaging in some new projects in Indo-Gangetic Plain while we stay engaged in the Caribbean, and we hope to share progress on these projects in years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa. The next speaker, the last for this session, is Jenny Frankel-Reed from USAID.
Great. So this is not a very inspiring title, but our tagline for this program is actually Connecting Space to Village, and you'll see why. So I'm just going to go through what is SERVIR, some climate services highlights, and some lessons and directions. At its sort of essence, SERVIR works with regional institutions to get information into the hands of decision makers to improve climate resilient low emissions development. So adaptation is part of it, but also sustainable landscapes from the USAID perspective and how we reduce emissions from land use and land use change. It's a joint initiative of USAID and NASA, but the network currently is depicted here. We started in Central America in 2005, so this is going on 10 years now. It was started as really a regional project to help Central America deal with things like protected areas management, using satellite data for that, and weather forecasting. This was before Google Earth, and a lot of the access that has become available since that time to provide access to geospatial information. And so this collaboration really proved to be something that could be relevant everywhere, and it's grown since then. SERVIR Mekong was just kicked off most recently, and the next region that we're looking at is West Africa. So who is SERVIR? I don't know why these are coming in like that. The sort of power of SERVIR is collaboration. So NASA has among its objectives the goal of providing societal benefit from its investments in space and Earth observation. It has a network of 22 Earth observing satellites, and all the data in line with US government policy is open. But it doesn't have an international mandate. It's a domestically focused agency. So it really is about providing value to the US from these investments. USAID, on the other hand, you're familiar with its objective. We work on issues that require a lot of information and data in the places and the parts of the world that lack information and data. And so that's kind of the opportunity, and combined with the fact that we have field offices and partners in more than 70 countries around the world. So this connection between NASA's science and data and USAID's need and connection to users around the world is really the core of the collaboration. In terms of how that gets delivered, we work through regional institutions that you saw on the map before. I'll say very quickly just a word about each. In the middle, that's the logo for the Regional Center for Mapping Resources for Development based in Nairobi. They have 20 member states across Eastern and Southern Africa, and a long-standing mandate to provide mapping, land cover, GIS services. It's a very technical institution. ICIMAD, but also one that's very closely aligned with governments, and so they have a regular governance process to get sort of the needs from those member countries expressed to our CMRD. ICIMAD, many of you are probably familiar with, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development based in Kathmandu, serving 8 or 9 countries across the Hindu Kush and Himalaya region, from Afghanistan, Pakistan to China. They are a very strong international research focused organization looking at mountain ecological processes, hydrology, snow, some of these issues for sustainable mountain sort of livelihoods. ADPC is the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center based in Bangkok, and they have a very long and strong history of working on community-based disaster risk reduction. They have some offices within countries across the region in addition to that regional office. They joined SERVIR as a consortium, so they recognized that they needed some more technical partners. And so ADPC has come with SIG, Deltares, and SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute, to join SERVIR. We have a demand team that was brought on in the last couple of years to help us with things like communications, evaluation, codifying our user base, collecting our tools. And then we have this really deep research collaboration team that you can read there. These are NASA-funded, US-based institutes that are doing science research and applications together with our hubs and regional partners to really connect the information to the needs on the ground. So this is just quickly to say, so what do we focus on doing? How do we keep some focus within this sort of large and expansive area of need? We have 3 results that we hope will lead to the objective of increasing the use of this information in decision making. One is improving capacity of analysts and decision makers to work with the data. The second is awareness of and access to the data. And the third is the provision and development of user-tailored tools and products. Recognizing that if you have the capacity to use it and the tool works, but you can't get it, it falls apart. Similarly, if the tool is available and it actually meets the need, but people don't know how to use it, it still falls apart. So all of these things are interdependent. This chain I just wanted to put up, which is very similar to what we heard from the previous presentations on production, translation, transfer, and use. It takes collaboration, and we've already heard that fairly convincingly, but I want to recognize that there are pushes and there are pulls, and that's kind of where we're trying to work more effectively in recognizing what's out there that can be delivered better and what isn't available yet that people still need. And so there are gaps all along this chain if you look at different situations, but this is really our challenge. A quick glance at the results of the project so far. 62 tailored decision support tools. Many of these are still in development, but a growing set as we expand. A number of institutions engaged. We've done a pretty exciting university fellowship program and reached a lot of just so inspiring to see what young people are imagining and developing. They're much smarter than we are. A number of small grants, recognizing that it doesn't always take a lot of money to do something really innovative and get it into people's hands. And we're now measuring better our online usage, and we've had 2 million map requests using the SERVIR mapper that lets you interact with some of the data and create your own visualizations in the last 2 years. This is something we're very proud of, which does not sound complicated, but to capture in a systematic way, in a way people can read and understand easily what each product does, know who it's for, what information has gone into it, a comprehensive product catalog. And so the URLs, if you prefer the English or the American or the British spelling, either one will work for servircatalog.net. And there you can search using a map or using filters like by region, theme, data source. If you're interested in who's doing what with MODIS data, you can get to it that way as well. So I'll just give a couple of highlights of some of the ways in which SERVIR is developing climate services and really focusing on kind of the pull side. So in Bangladesh, I'm sure many of you are aware, seasonal flooding is devastating, and the Bangladesh Flood Forecasting and Warning Center has been working on this issue for a long time, has had a lot of sophisticated tools in place. One of the challenges was access to data from India upstream. So in order to drive the hydrologic model for Bangladesh, because of where the water originates, that was a gap. And so what was tested through this SERVIR project was whether new satellite data available from the Jotun satellite, which basically collects river heights all around the world as the satellite passes over, whether that could provide a reliable enough estimate of stream flow upstream anywhere to drive the model downstream. And it worked. So researchers from the University of Washington partnered with initially the Institute for Water Modeling in Bangladesh, and then later transferred it once it proved to be accurate to the Flood Forecasting and Warning Center, increasing the lead time from an average of 3 days to 8 days, which really means there's a whole new set of options for preparing for floods. We have, in August of 2014, when the system was used and predicted a flood wave much earlier than the old system. We're looking at the data now, but historically, on average, those kinds of floods resulted in thousands of deaths, and this year it was, I believe it was 17. So some really transformative technology solutions that could be adapted in sort of large basins in other regions as well. We're excited actually because the Red Cross has said, well, with 8 days, we can do something with that information. We can actually move people around with 8 days, and so they're very interested in how to take that tool further. Frost mapping, I won't get into as much detail, but this was a very simple tool where nighttime land surface temperatures can be used to map frost potential for tea and coffee farmers in the highland areas of Eastern Africa. And the exciting thing here is that the Tea Research Foundation of Kenya is using this and getting the information out, and the insurance industry now feels that they can offer an insurance product around frost because there is a credible way to assess damage that they didn't have before. So just a quick look at some of the data that's available from satellites. These are all out there. I have a little worksheet that I asked NASA to give me so I had a better understanding of the frequency, the resolution of all of these data sets, but there's a lot of data that can be used to complement, as Lisa said, the ground data. And two new ones at the bottom there, SMAP, which is soil moisture that just is going up, I guess just went up, and a new carbon satellite. So lots of potential here. A few lessons to wrap up. Satellite data can add value. In the case of the Bangladesh one, it can totally change the way that decision support tools in certain contexts work. Others have already said this, but really sustainable service provision requires that we slow down. It requires that we find the staff with the skills, make the time, budget, plan activities around all of these things, engaging users, developing the science and products, testing them and refining them, sharing the data. All you can see it there. It's more than we think of. If we already know that something works well, why not just do it quickly somewhere else? You actually still have to do all of this again. No single institution can do all of this. That chain is, again, part of our lesson learned, and we're looking more now at consortia of institutions rather than a single organization. We still need better ways to replicate and scale successful products and tools. We are extremely proud of this, and it is just a scratch on the surface of the kinds of tools that we could develop for people and the number of people that really need this information. And so, you know, your ideas, the opportunities that you see in the work that you do, we're very eager to hear how we could better scale and replicate what works. And then finally, there is a lot of great science happening across US institutions, internationally, and universities, and we see a lot of scope for increasing technical collaborations around SERVIR. And so we will be focusing more on that in future years. Finally, I'll say that we're in the middle/early part of a 3-year external evaluation of the program that will look at 3 questions. And so we are starting to learn already in one case that a tool that was developed 9 years ago is consulted on a daily basis and is still used and is a really good example of sustainability. And in another case, that a tool that everybody wants, that sounds good, that we can develop, isn't being used. And so we have a lot still to learn across what we're doing about how to make every tool a success. Thanks.
Thank you. So, first of all, thanks to all the speakers for very good presentations and for keeping the time. We now want to hear from you. So we have about 15 minutes for your comments and questions, and the floor is open. Yes.
Hi, Hi, this question's for the SERVIR and Jenny Frankel-Reed. Did the people who could have otherwise provided and maybe sold the upstream data products for Bangladesh realized what they've missed now, that by not doing this, that they can get this information from satellites, and maybe it makes their data less valuable? I assume it was the Indian Met Services wouldn't release it to the Bangladesh.
That's right, and I actually don't know the answer. I think I was fascinated by that data sharing issue. They were less fascinated by it. They were more interested in how do we use this technology, but I will try and find out. I mean, I think it's an important lesson, which is that if the resolution is right for what you need, this opens up a lot of data that may actually result in that situation, but more often still requires that local data to calibrate it. In the case of Bangladesh, they've got such good historic observations that they were able to calibrate that stream height data without India.
I guess where I was going, this might be a cautionary tale to people who don't release their data. So that if you don't, there's other people who will, and that may keep you from being more successful in the future.
Yeah, agreed.
Dan Other, U.S. Department of State. First of all, thanks all of you for fantastic presentations. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the difference between access to information and the use of that information as knowledge and empowerment. I heard a number of themes from a number of the speakers, for instance, with regard to Jamaica. If you made weather forecasts that people couldn't understand, then some people could use it, but other people might not be able to. I heard this in the reference with SERVIR about having data, but pre and post Google Earth kind of world and how we look at data. So I'm free for anyone to take the question, but I'm curious, when we're thinking in terms of stakeholders and we're thinking in terms of engagement and empowerment, what do you see as the barriers to the different levels that we would hit people with this information? Is this something that we're thinking about, you know, the example of the smartphone and an individual farmer being able to do this, or are we thinking this would be things done at the regional collective? How does this map with our empowering of development in communities and individuals and nation states?
So I will start making some comments, and then I'll open the comments for the panel. I think, first of all, one of the lessons, at least that we have learned in the last 20 years, is that the solution to that challenge varies completely from one place to another, one country to another, and even within the same countries. And the two elements in common that I think are important. One has to do with, I'm going to use, again, the example of the medical service. One thing that is critical, let's suppose that the CAT scan is good, works well, we got the best that the technology can offer. Now, you have two doctors. You know, I have dealt with doctors that when they have to tell you what the CAT scan is saying, they can be extremely confusing, and they can be, you know, sometimes it seems like they're trying for you to not understand, right? And then you have the other type of doctors, the doctors that, you know, they speak in plain English, they associate what he's seeing with your lifestyle. So, first of all, now we depend on these skills, natural skills of people. What we learned is that it's critical to train those people, the people that are communicating information. The second element that I would like to stress is the user, again with the example of the Uruguayan beef eater. The truth is that if that person receives education, access to good information in the right format, even an Argentinian may change eating habits. And I think, so very often I think that very often we don't put enough efforts in working with these users, this concept of user, whatever it is. Sometimes it's a minister of agriculture, sometimes it's a community of small farmers. But we don't put enough efforts in I don't want to say training or educating, but at least interacting with those users in order to help them to connect information with action, information with decisions, information with planning. Now I'll open the panel for further questions. Glenroy?
Very good question. I'd like to say that it depends on the user. I think the success story for Jamaica is that we tried to not to develop the tool and then take it to the farming community, but to actually go to the farming community and actually look at their needs. And we realized that those tools that were created with the farmers' information, the farmers' input, the stakeholders' input, are received better. So when we go back to collect feedback from the farming community, from the stakeholders, it's very easy to communicate and for them to use the tool going forward. We have developed similar tools for different sectors, and we have tried to, what we try to do is to do a lot of engagement with the users. So it's very time-consuming, sometimes it's very expensive, but it's beneficial that we engage these users, and we're dedicating tools towards the farming community, agriculture. So we spend a lot of time going to their community, speaking to them at their level, in their comfort zone, and we realize that the tools are better served if you have their input.
Can I add? Sure. One example from East Africa that I find very interesting, the we have a hydrologic modeling tool where you can pick a point and basically get the stream flow and a projection. Initially was developed for an irrigation authority to understand flood and drought conditions. Then the Water Allocation Authority wanted to use the same information for their types of decisions. And then the hydropower company wanted to use, again, the same data for another application. In the case of a regional institution with which SERVIR partners, the appropriate level of support is national, most of the time, because that's the authority of that institution to provide advice. A USAID project that's working with, maybe with the hydropower sector or with the agriculture sector could certainly engage then NGOs and local communities in taking those tools further. So I think we have all been saying similar things, which is we match kind of the users to the authority of the partner providing the information, but I think it has huge potential at both scales. It just depends where we want to invest.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes. So I have one in the back and then you, Meredith.
Okay, thank you. This is Meredith Muth from NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I feel like if this was a climate services drinking game, you always end up with replicate and transfer. And so a couple of you mentioned, how the desire and the actual action of replicating and transfer successful tools and products. For example, I hear constantly through the Caribbean the Jamaica success story and how they would like to replicate it. But my question for the panelist is flipping it over, assuming there was an effective assessment program to determine if it was successful or unsuccessful. Are there any lessons learned or examples that you have of what do you do with unsuccessful products and tools and services and processes that you have invested time and resources into developing, and how you are actually bringing that back in, whether through USAID programs or IRI or SERVIR, et cetera, how you're bringing that back in to inform future investments? Thank you.
You want to, yeah, go ahead.
That's a really great and very challenging question. It's sort of like,
Lisa, for taking it.
we'll see how smart of a move that was in a minute. But to bring in another analogy, it's like having an old car that you're sort of, wondering how, am I going to put another new tire on that car? Am I going to take it for a tune-up, or should I just, leave it by the side of the road? Sometimes you really love that car. But it is very important in those circumstances for everyone involved, absolutely the researchers, but the communities that they're trying to target, as well as the funding agencies that have their own ideas of what they want to accomplish, to go back and revisit what was it that's not connecting. Is it the process? It might just be the timeliness. I mean, it might be a technical issue that actually can be overcome. But the relevance can't be overstated. I mean, if the information is not connecting to an audience that's supposed to be taking it up, then that's going to be an issue. And I think at that point, it's maybe not the best idea to take that hammer and go around and figure out what you can smash with it. You really need to maybe come back to the drawing board and think about what were you trying to accomplish in the first place? What community are we trying to work with? And actually think again about designing the right information or the right tools to address that community. I think very often we heard some kind of, pilot study bashing the other day, which, pilot studies can mean different things. In some cases, it's just doing something in a really focused way so that you can develop it completely and fully, and then think about how the transfer, the scale-up is appropriate. Might not be appropriate everywhere. Coffee exists only part of the Caribbean, but it also exists in other parts of the world. So seeming failures do need to be reviewed. That requires time and money also. But I think that the scientists and the funding agencies should not be afraid to leave that by the side of the road when it's really not an effective approach.
Just a small comment connecting what we're going to do after the coffee break. I think that the summary of what Lisa is saying is the importance of having a good evaluation program. I mean, evaluating also the products, the tools that didn't work. Because then you may learn that the tool was great. The CAT scan was pretty good, but if you're talking to the physician, to the researcher that is doing X-ray research, you're not going to get advantage, or you're not talking to the right people. You're not taking advantage of the networks. And sometimes what gets blamed is a tool. Sometimes it's right, the tool was not good, but sometimes it's a process that didn't work. So, okay, I had another question in the back.
Yeah, this is John Randall with DAI, and I guess I had a question for Glenroy, and thank you very much for these excellent presentations. The question kind of has to do with behavior change, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's about getting the climate data in a usable form that can change behaviors on the ground. And it seemed like in this Jamaica example, the farmers are really being equipped with data and information that they can use. And I'm wondering if part of that program design was also looking at how farmers' practices were changing as a result of getting some of this information. And if some of these other projects also had kind of a behavior change assessment component, and if there's need to kind of provide technical assistance in addition to the climate services data provision to help, to help the user respond to the information they're given.
All right, good question. Yes, it did brought with it some behavior changes, not just from the initial sessions that we had with the farmers. What we did afterward was to partner with ACDI Vocal, which is an arm of the USAID funded in Jamaica. And what they did was to continue the work through what we call the Farmers Field School Project. So you get a group of farmers within a school environment, and you teach them not about climate services alone, but how do you make these changes now on the farm level? What are the measures that you can put in place, like drip irrigation, water harvesting, what time to spray based on the winds and all of that information, the temperature. So it's basically not just a one visit to those communities. They have to be enrolled into a system where they will learn not just about the products and the tools that we are doing, but also how to use that information to their benefit, to their advantage on the farm, in their community.
Okay, so I'm not sure if this means I'm going to be decapitated or it means that we have no more time. But we'll be back in what, 10 minutes? 7 minutes?
Yeah, apparently we have a lot of people online. That's great. Feel free to ask questions from online, but for that reason, we want to get the next session going on time so they're not just hanging out there. So feel free to grab a coffee and come back in, enjoy it in here, stick your empty plate under your chair, whatever. But let's try to start. We'll be back with Ed in about 7 or 8 minutes. 10:45. 10:45.